Hello, and welcome to our audience and to our speaker, to our final few lectures on global Asia in a multipolar world. I'm Julianne Schober, and I direct the Center for Asian Research, and I'm glad you're joining us this morning. I want to direct your attention to the remainder of our lectures throughout April. And after that, we'll be on hiatus until August, late August. And we hope you will join us again at that point. But right now, I want to introduce to you my colleague, Professor Alexander Hen, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much and welcome everybody out there, and welcome. It's a great pleasure to welcome and introduce to you our today's speaker. That is Dr. Suraj Yengde. And I want to say a few words about Suraj and his work. I think it's worth mentioning that Suraj has his origins himself in a Dalit community that is an oppressed community formerly known untouchable in the small town in India, western coast state of Maharashtra. And he today is probably one of the best known and widely read Indian scholar and writer about global social justice. Suraj got his PhD and a law degree in international human rights from the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. And he currently holds a position at Harvard Kennedy School and also is a senior fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Studies. Now, just to mention that Suraj's most recent and also probably most popular book is the best-selling Penguin book on caste matters. And it is from this very, very title that we can see this resonating with his today's lecture, in which he not only argues and says that race and caste, and for that matter, slavery and untouchability are not only the arguably most oldest forms of social injustice and discrimination in the world, but they are also the most persevering and contemporary form of social, of universal social practice of oppression and discrimination. And it is in this field that Suraj's academic work is certainly most impactful and most important today, where he brings together these two aspects of social justice and oppression. And he does so as an academic writer and scholar, authoring a number of books. The one I mentioned, Just Caste Matter, is the latest one. He is the co-editor of the award-winning book, The Radical Ambedkar, Ambedkar being, of course, the founding father and founding activist in Dalit studies. And he is the author of a forthcoming book entitled Caste, A New History of the World. And in doing so, I would want to mention that too, he is very instrumental and active now with a number of other very well-known rising intellectual stars in bringing up and bringing together these, what we would say, new scholarly field of caste and race studies, Dalit and Black studies, together with people, scholars like Isabel Wilkerson, the Pulitzer Prize winning author of Caste, The Origin of Our Discontents in New York, and also Gajendranath Ayyadurai in Göppingen, Germany, all of which are working together in bringing together Dalit Black Lives Matter studies. I want to, in concluding, I want to say that Yengde's work is also important as a political writer and public intellectual. And he, in recent years, he literally has published hundreds of lectures and essays, interviews and podcasts, and has an enormous media echo in very global and important media outlets in the world, in BBC, Al Jazeera, Indian Express, Huffington Post, and also in local weekly journals in Maharashtra. He still keeps on writing a weekly column. And with these words, I want to pass on and say with great pleasure and anticipation, here is Dr. Suraj Yengde. Please, Suraj.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a very resounding and very encouraging. If it was a stage, the audience would just like, woo, woo. And thank you, Alexander, for that, really, for bringing that energy online and in person. First of all, I want to be extend my extreme gratitude to the two people I see on screen, rather three. First, Alexander, for reaching out. And we were meant to do this first online, what we are doing now. And then we said, okay, why not do it in person? And unfortunately, we are doing it online now. Also to Julianne for her courtesy and help in chaperoning. And I'm really excited. I mean, Arizona State, I've never been. I've been to Arizona. So I'm happy to be amidst you. And I was also very happy to learn that something called Jan Studies is going to be, is something that is going to be launched, or I guess somebody's undertaking the project. Terrific work. And to our colleague Chan for keeping up with so many changes and iterations and all the logistical, and also my colleague Sam. Thank you to also friends and colleagues who have joined online, and I look forward to this conversation. Today's topic is something I thought we can also workshop in the sense that the past century that Du Bois so enigmatically and in his clairvoyance had declared to be a century that will wrestle prominently with the question of color. And color that he mentioned was not necessarily only the color as a human or individual based interaction, but it was going much more deeper. It was a systemic, which was eventually sanctified as a structural and institutional aspect of color. Then that could, one of the manifestations of that we saw in modern sense was it came to us through colonization and the debates that took place after colonization, post-colonization. And so we see several phases of the 20th century. I am more concerned about our century, the 21st, and what are these metaphors that we might have to wrestle with, that we might have to engage with, fight with, negotiate with. And I think in my devotion to this century across multiple generations, I've been trying to think through various phases. I'm trying to also dig into some Oriental archives, some Occidental archives. I'm also trying to find parallels and differences, so we can really provide a cogent theory that could help us, not least in academic framings of the social sciences and beyond, but also for the activists and also in the policy making domain. And in that context, we thought, why not think about how the politicization takes place, be it casteism, be it racism, and within this two frames that appear different, and they are certainly different because of its registers that it operates in, and the historical inventory is vastly different. Nevertheless, ontologically, it is something that will help us unite some of this created, human-made, I can say man-made teleologies in this context, and that's why excuse me, that's why when we think about the contemporary era, there are several problems we face. If you look through Euro-American perspective, the only problem probably we might see, especially structurally, is race, is a color-based, and through that then we see other what can be identified as subsets, the idea of capitalism, the idea of gender justice, the idea of climate change politics, as well as we can see that percolating in immigration, refugee politics, and also in its modern avatar, the new form sexualized politics that has also gotten the racial canon, and much of the work has been done in that direction. But what happens to the world where these metaphors like race or color do not necessarily ring bells for the people, do not necessarily gain traction when we mention race or color? And in this case, I'm looking at those societies who have had hierarchies and systemic formulations of societies in the way we understand, but also there are semantics that relate and correlate to the various subsets that I talked about. And in this case, we thought, why not just then look at the original sin of race and how it manifests in today's context. Now, when we talk about race, in this case also caste, but caste we'll come back to later, we are usually talking about how it manifests in operation. And that operation is predicated on oppression of a vast humanity that had a register of few centuries. In a context that where race or color might not necessarily invite any form of activism, any form of critical attention, there remains a vast gap to then bring some of these theories into action. And I'm looking at South Asia. How do we really describe South Asia in racial or color terms? Scholars who worked on South Asia know quite well in their own research, and even the histories they might deal with, it's a vastly different geography, but also it operates on its own axis. What are those axes? This axis is I've written about it in my next book that Alexander was mentioning. These, I call them axiotomic heterotopias. These are the framings of Occidental and Oriental divides of understanding of society. And that's how we see a canon was developed. So to make sense of a society where this prevailing theories and amazing work done in the Western metropole might not necessarily reflect easily or cannot be borrowed in toto, but needs to be critically engaged. In this context, what we will then see is there is something more peculiar and something more unique to this system. And then we thought, how about looking at a phenomena that has been existing for so long? Its origin might have had a different purpose, but it has graduated into becoming the system that is regulating the life and purpose of people. And in this case, I'm talking about caste. Now, caste is not unique to the South Asian theology and society, but also the hermeneutics of addressing caste can be, the template of that can be used in the societies where there are vertical hierarchies strictly codified to uphold a certain societal norms. And in this case, there is a possibility that the racialization of a society that takes place through colonization primarily produces a society that really advantageous race as a national concept, race as a cultural concept, race as a religious concept. And we see those three axioms working to describe what we call in today's context racial politics. Religion, if somebody is from certain religion, if it's a minority, if you deal with the Western societies, it's more or less it's looked up as an issue of racism. But if you use the same example in other contexts, you might not necessarily find any registers. It's that dialogue changes. So does happen with nationality. Nation as a colonial output of uniting or clubbing so many tribes together, so many castes, so many independent kingdoms together to form a modern nation state, still gets its mirror reflection in a certain global norm framing. Now, within this nationalism, also, if there is a collusion of different states, and here states, I mean to say the condition as a state, not state as a capital S. Then again, we are facing difficulties to describe this. Then it becomes the idea of racism, depending on immigration and so forth. And the third, of course, is culture. And the Marxist thinkers, Etienne Balibar, for example, had profoundly written about it as to how class, nation, and race club together. And Eric Hobsbawm, for example, the great historian of Europe and, of course, an extension of the world, had focused on how culture kind of manipulates, or culture becomes a central piece. And that's why we have a huge genre of cultural studies. And for me, approaching the dualism of race and caste has to form through the cultural studies framework. Why cultural studies? Cultural studies offers us not only comfortable or comforting, competing terminologies, but cultural studies also in its belief in the evolutionary sense of undermining, or of looking or examining the society. Now, within this paradigm, we can talk about how cultural studies forms, but the one thing one can pay attention to is Stuart Hall and his important intervention in really bringing out a certain paradigm. Now, this is a story that can be well told and well described in a certain geography, not the world, not the globe. Because if we do that, we really then exclude, much to our regret, much of this. And that's why, to really counter some of these telos that are operating in the totemic sense, in an anthropological of totemic sense of society, we need a new framework. And that framework perhaps is, and I argue, is a global caste theory. And global caste is simply, I've written a paper about it, and I will just read out how I pursue global caste. I mean, I look at it as it's as a geographical, but also it's a ideological distinction that we will have to grapple with. And within global caste, it's a layered mechanism of an immovable social hierarchy and an absolute control that aims to dehumanize certain form of labor through both structural and economic terms, but also there is a huge investment of as I called, as a practice of the culture. And these forms, dehumanizing of a certain labor, locating in fixed hierarchies, and this inhibition to recognize these people into a set framework. Now, these are the people I'm talking about for whom we don't have yet globally accepted framework. So the constituency I'm dealing with is so ambiguous for policy as well as anthropological theory. And I talk this as a trained anthropologist in this discipline. And for that, we need to look through the cultural understanding of how reproduction takes place. And reproduction here manifests through the sexualization of labor. And the sexualization of labor here also means, here simply means that the woman as a primary agent, as an agential arbiter in describing a society on reproduction. And that's why the centrality it's of a matriarchal nature. It might not be patriarchy, or it might not be matriarchy, but matriarchal nature of how reproduction takes place, which is through the conduit of endogamy. And the endogamy then, of course, supported by the existing rule book of ritual. Now, when we use these terms, it's very difficult to talk about reason, capital R, and rational, capital R, because reason and rational were the primary intellectual weapons of the modern Enlightenment projects. So it's very difficult now to bring that into a focus that might really highlight some of this. But if you have to really decipher the condition of the people who live under this immovable social hierarchies, and these are all the people in many societies, and where there is a fixed ascription of a status of labor, then we will have to ask the questions that I'm trying to propose. And so how do we then look at caste, let's say in African context? And a bishop from Nigeria, Anthony Obina, and I will quote him. I mean, he was looking at caste through a modern slavery framework, and it's not that different. And modern slavery is different than the slavery that we are used to usually talking about in America, but also we don't have much registers of slavery that existed, let's say, in South India, or a system of slavery that was not recognized as slavery, yet had all those dimensions existing in society. And in this case, I'm talking about the caste system concerning the untouchable groups within the India's religio-social hierarchy. And Anthony Obina, Bishop says, who is commenting on the caste differences, and just to give a primer, there exists a caste system across the world. We just have to apply. And my objective is, if there is a theory, then maybe we need to reanalyze or analyze certain societies based on perhaps this new advantageous framework. Perhaps there is an agreement or disagreement, but maybe it makes sense beyond the axiotomic heterotopias of Occidental and Oriental kind of, the holy war of Edward Said versus the rest kind of past centuries project. Not that I don't want to deny, not that I'm denying the locus of that, but if you look at it through this quote, it will make sense. He says, in some ways, it is even worse, and he's talking about the caste difference in Igbo land, it is even worse than black-white divide in America. We speak, and he's referring to the Igbo land people, especially the Osu and Ohu. We eat and the Dialas, these are the caste groups. He commented, Bishop Anthony says, we speak the same language, eat the same food, and there is really no facial or cultural difference. But yet we see there is a divide, which is much more stark than what we see in black and white America. Now this quotation might also be taken in a context that, what if there are no black and white divides? What if there are identical features that do not fit the register of racializing? How do we then engage with the question of this discrimination and brutality? Now, due to the overemphasis of this, is basically Franz Boas, who comes to America and establishes excellent anthropology department. His student Hertzkovich and they all go about and doing phenomenal work. Boas himself primarily was concerned also with the question of caste. At the same time, he was developing the theories of race or ethnicity. Now, ethnicity becomes a marker to describe a society where racial denominations do not adequately make sense in this case. And again, ethnicization is related to a cultural hegemonic praxis that operates within a global altar, on the altar of globalisms, either global north, global south, west, east, and the geographical configurations. In this case, what we need to also see is, irrespective or discounting those for a moment, we will see the most societies around the world, they have followed a trajectory of modernizing. They modernize through differentially valuing and devaluing the human body, and this can be reduced through the Marxist framework of labor as surplus, and we know the drill. But also it can be looked at how society was usually placed in hierarchies, justifying for its regulation, for its decency, and for its necessity. So even though the caste existed for different forms, I argue we should not lose a focus on the ones who were at the extreme end of caste, who were the victims of caste system, the ones upon whom caste system was practiced. and clearly it is not just one theory, but there are multiple theories about it. Caste in American registers had two forms of understandings. One was racial caste, other was color caste. And now one might see it as an innocent difference, but a color caste was basically, as the great anthropologist Alison Davis in the early in the first half of the 20th century commented, and I quote him: color caste is an integration of the basic institution. What is the basic institution? Where the largest system, that of color caste, does exist as a form of social order. So there is a certain social logic that operates to ordering a society, and so when we so how do we then make sense of what we call racializing caste or racial caste? Now we should know that the interpretation of caste or dealing with caste comparatively as a global is new. I mean, some people, I should be careful when I say this. In fact, let me take that back. In fact, the earliest studies that were done on caste were usually we can talk about the 1700s, when caste was again, and of course our Alexander was talking about the registers of Portuguese. We have that in the 15th century, Barbosa and so forth. We have a rich kind of a trajectory of dealing with it. But I'm talking through anthropological reading of caste. Now, there must be existing anthropology as a discipline, but we didn't call it yet. But I'm using it as a citation to refer to comparatively understand caste through this anthropology. Because I mean, why? Because anthropology's primary investment of understanding society was very much Eurocentric racial estimation of biological and anatomical illiteracy. Race as was basically an illiterate concept that was still yet to be developed. Blumenbach, especially in German, studying was somebody who was wrestling with this question. And of course, we have many owners of different ownerships of race and caste, and that's why. So the racial caste in this case, I argue, is rooted in the sociological understanding of society, not cultural. The way we understand is through the totem and the ritual and the practice as a culture. In this case, it's sociological because the distribution of resources and control of labor, as well as the biopolitics, is centered. So again, there is a material aspect, and we know slavery in America or even in the Caribbean was primarily rooted as a part of a capitalist project, modern capitalism, of course, extraction of this body by removing the humanity that was given to the labor and making them slave. So a racial caste is one can argue, a highly complex and irrational form of segmentation that was developed in the colonial slavery habitus. That's when it kind of, you need those, you need to have that apparatus of colonial regime as well as slavery, or either of or both, to really develop the racial caste. And that was the concept that was prominently known in America. Isabel Wilkerson, as it was described, she went to some of those histories, trying to excavate some of those dialogues, but the historical register is much more richer, and which I hope to do, not the next book, but the book after that I'm still working on, where we go and really examine the American society through this paradigms. And so the way I look at this kind of way of describing society is not necessarily related only to the Euro-American or South Asian space. It also has an enormous purchase within the other parts of the world. And just to mention them, I'm just going to do a laundry list of countries and the caste groups that exist, and just for the sake of citation. In Senegal, it's the community is called Nieno. Now my pronunciation may be terrible, so excuse me, but it's Nieno who are the hereditary. Hereditary is basically a regulation of a proper systemic labored caste system. They are shoemakers, blacksmiths, or goldsmiths who are considered as the lower caste, and they are part of the Wolof society. When we go to, or also there are griots, the griots is again I mean, much research has been done in that direction. In Rwanda, what we have is the Twa, which are very minority. They are hunters and craftsmen. They are not like the Hutu and Tutsi, the unholy divide they had. But these are again the minorities. But they but they exist within both the Tutsi as well as the Hutu. Now we know that if you look at the caste, if you apply the caste lens, if you look through the caste perspective, the Tutsi were the aristocratic and pastoralists, the landowning aristocratics, and the Hutu were again, of course, farmers and commoners. Now they might be overlap, and it's a very simplified explanation I'm offering, and I forgive for that. So, but within those also did exist the population called Twa, who were the hunters and craftsmen, who were separate from aristocrats, from pastoralists, from farmers and commoners. So there exists this group within which there remains much more undefined understanding or undiscussed discourse because of this the other border contours we have. In Kenya, which I wanted to study at some point, there is a Wata system. And these are the Watas. They are the lowest caste, and they are part of the Kenyan hierarchy of the caste system. I read this article where it talked about manual scavengers coming from specific caste also in Kenya. And that was and these are the people who occupy the lowest hierarchy. The same is observed in Somalia. In Somalia, there is the Sab group, the Midigan, Tumal, and Yibir. These are again within the Islamic society still exists a very strict hierarchy of caste system. In Mali, they are called Bela, the slaves, and also I was told by my friend, the Malian scholar and filmmaker, about how the castes are pertinent, how they're central to the Malian society. Doesn't matter whichever part of the corridor you exist. And then we of course see in Mauritania there is this Haratin. Still the slavery is undergoing in Mauritania, which is basically the global caste slavery that I'm talking about. Same happens in Nigeria, the Osu and Ohu. In France, again, it is unjustifiably argued that caste system was not really a European concept, or it was mostly class lens that we need to apply to really understand. But that is an incorrect statement, especially if you look through the French history, not least the revolution. You will see how the various caste groups form, and we have incredible work done on that, and more of that is coming out. But they were called Kago. In Japan, we have Burakumin. In Brazil, more or less, there is this Brazilian racial color hierarchy is enmeshed, and it's much more complicated than the simplified definitions we can apply to. But there exists a group that really identifies itself with the movement as gaining a separate attention for their rights, the Culumbos, but also within them the mulattoes and pados, who again form the different caste context, or in English, or in this definition, it becomes a racial groups. Mexico is a very well-established case wherein there exist mestizos and mestizakes and castizos. This is again a great research done, and these are kind of prominent frontiers, and we see this happening across the west and west-south part of Africa. So does in Central Africa, but we don't have yet research. But what we do know is that the caste system, wherever it is, we need to apply the Iberian nexus, the reach of Iberia, whatever part of the world they go, they did not leave those societies without their interpretation. And so if you look at that, then we really are seeing a much more subtle and much more rooted rubrics of the global caste system that we see. And to close, I would like to offer how this manifestation might help us in describing the theory of origin and so forth. We need to we need to look at the comparable examples that we see in some parts and really examine the society. And I think global caste has this investment and interest of interpreting society through much more comparative perspective. And so to really make sense of a global caste framework and theory, it has to rely on comparative studies. And these comparisons might not always be complementary with each other. One has to be, but then if there exists a system that is not easily explainable in the heretofore explanations of other societies, then perhaps there exists a system that we need to perhaps focus. And so there are certainly interesting studies of caste, especially in East, North, and Central and Western Africa. I mean, it was done, and some scholars from the African studies did not appreciate it, that intervention, and I can see why. Personally, I cannot assume why, but if I look through Indian example, then we know why. If there appears equivalent of African Brahmins or the people who were from the dominant tribe or dominant caste within their societies, there certainly will be a difference. But again, this is just a speculative fiction for now, because there hasn't been adequate study done by me personally. But that's something that I'm going to do in the second phase of this research. And so I argue it's not just Africa or Latin America or the group that I frame. We also need to perhaps look at how caste-like formations exist also within the modernist classifications that we have developed through class, colonialism, and nationalism. There were many of these strategies that made a common census category. And so that's why in modern census that we inherit, there is much more a thick archive that one can really muddy their hands. And that's why I think that global caste slavery, if we look that if these metaphors resonate with your societies, perhaps, which are, if there is a social rank that is granted from the time you are born, the mother's womb, the discrimination that is premised on purity and pollution, if there is a endogamy that is enforced and that is practiced freely, if there is an occupational ranking in society, that happens also without caste society, there is always occupational ranking. If there is a fight and contest to the racial, to the hierarchical sanctity, there is a sanction given to the hierarchy. If there is a stigma and shame attached to the particular caste group, if there is, as a punishment, there is a community or communal ostracization, if there is an inferiority granted to certain group, and this is different from being ranked, there is already an inferiority given. And in this sense, there is a justification of the system. A government and the body politic of governmentality is not ready or prepared or yet to create these categories of distinctions. If this system is used in lieu of ethnic or racial theory, or if there are cases where people from certain groups are banned from occupying higher status in politics and society, then we are looking at the possibilities of a global caste society, a theory, a framework that can conceptually perhaps help and amplify some of the quote-unquote left out communities. Thank you. I can't hear you guys.
Can you now?
Yeah, I can now.
Lose you? Okay. Thank you very much, Suraj. This was a very thought-provoking presentation, and I'm sure we're going to have quite a number of questions and comments. And I'm looking at Chan to let us know whether there are people out there who wanted to say something or ask something.
you can type your question in the chat box or Q&A, or you can also raise your hand and we can let you speak.
Yes. Let me know when there are people out
I have
there.
something.
Maybe Juliana,
May
you
I
want to
take
start?
the time
Yeah.
while we're waiting for folks to either type in or let us know otherwise about your interest to speak? First of all, thank you for a really engaging and forceful presentation that encourages us to rethink what caste is, and it's certainly not the sort of discussion of caste that I encountered in graduate school that described it essentially as a religious or theological system, but one that takes it out of the context of the Hindu particularities and looks at broader features of that kind of categorization across different cultural archives, if you so will. And so in that regard, that opens up very interesting questions, I would think, for someone who is like you, a human rights lawyer. And one wonders then, you know, how can we actualize that? How can we bring that into discussions of human rights law?
Thank you so much, Julian. And in fact, you know, I wanted to be intentionally provocative sometimes at some moments, because the purpose of that was to actually bring in the critical understanding of unhelpful existing frameworks at some point. And I'm very intentional in saying unhelpful, right? Why do I say that? Is kind of related to your question. Within the human rights framework, you know, at least at the United Nations level, there is not an accepted definition of caste. It's not even a debatable question. It is just given to what I call United Nations side hustle, the Human Rights Council, that is also not having a exclusive focus on caste, because of course the political lobby that works, Indian government refuses, whereas Nepal says no, it's important, and you know, we have this a kind of geopolitical, within the geopolitical issues, what they are happy to discuss is the prevalence of global north, or the idea of racism, because what it does is it privileges their victimhood, and within that language, it's happy to find, I mean, the Indian delegate can find many more I wouldn't say acolytes, but they will find many more people who can raise the hand when they will raise this question of race. But when it comes to caste, it has become a very sensitive topic. You know, I just don't want to talk about it. It has really confined, and that's what I'm trying to do. Is I'm trying to push now, and which is basically historical study, that, you know, it's not that people did not do the work. You know, in Indian context, in South Asian context, at least, you know, Louis Dumont did. Even in American context, people like Allison Davis and Lloyd Warner, and, you know, many people like within this rich sociology. We have Gerald Berriman coming and studying the communities anthropologically, and then of course there were naysayers and deniers in this case. In the human rights framework, what it has done is it has simply uplifted, I think, and I might be wrong, but they have uplifted the sociological knowledge, the sociological framing of the society. Human rights perspective, especially law perspective, it goes especially through the constitutional framing, will ask about the question of minoritization, the question of representation, the question of protection of civil and political liberties. Now, when we talk about that, what then we have is the constitution of each country say we don't discriminate, right? I mean, what are you talking about? We don't discriminate. So let's sanitize our hands and you know, go to. But that's not the focus. In the human rights perspective, I think we need a understanding of society that is not having privileged status of being a human right victim. These are the people who are second-class victims within this hierarchy of human rights issues. And that remains a very great and grave problem. Now, part of the reason I'm speculating, and again, I want to be very clear, this right at the moment, the speculation is going on because there are studies, by the way, that I can rely on that were done during colonial times, but many of the scholars were uncomfortable dealing with the question of caste, right? We have a guy called Pankhurst Alula who studied caste within the Horn of Africa, and especially Ethiopia, and kind of brought out this classic analysis. Yet we don't see that kind of taken on board, because what happens is it becomes a religious argument. Let's say if we go to Somalia, it becomes a Islamic argument, a radical Islam, militant Islam, and so forth. But that Islam there is not indigenous Islam, right? It has an Arabic influences, and so when we talk about Arabic influences, we are talking about the tribal difference. The tribal differences in practice is a caste difference if you look through the hierarchy of families that operate in the society. So what we essentially need to do is to really revisit some of these questions and some of these concepts that can help the society to really think in a term. Now, there is one fear also, right? There's a fear that, oh God, there's another issue. There we go. Like we're already dealing with racism. We're already dealing with tribalism. We're already dealing with this intra-cultural violence. There is a regional divide. The South wants the power. The North, especially in each country. I'm just giving example. So, and now you want to bring caste. Oh, you know what? Just stay put. So I can see why, because again, it might create a competing space for it. But I think one can perhaps apply a really and to be honest with you, it's the human rights framework that has given adequate recognition to the various caste debates. I think probably because law offers that, or probably law has that much more, I guess, flexibility than anthropologists who can be questioned on every turn they take. But there is a focus, and I think if a human rights based focus, a clinical approach is taken. That was my intention to do for my first PhD when I went to South Africa, but clearly the Indian government was not happy about it, and I was asked to not do it. But my main intention was to apply the human rights framework to Central Africa, Kenya, and Congo to really examine how the. But I think this is the 21st century question. I think that we might want to encourage.
And how are we?
We have a couple of questions coming in. So the first one is from Yashprit Birdie. As a graduate student exploring Dalai identity and the internationalization of the casteism cause, what are your views or recommendations for exploring the impacts of British colonization in the modernization of low caste communities in India for future academic research?
I think this is an interesting question. Yashprit, thank you for asking. I think we need the important focus of how British colonization dealt with this question. I mean, you can't really talk about any history at this moment without really registering the impact of colonization in any part of the world, right? And so what I would propose is that there has been an adequate focus done on British colonization and British imperial policies and how they manifested a caste in various forms and senses. But also I think what we could do in addition to that is, because there is this reductive focus, one is by the right wing, or whichever wing it is, maybe the caste wing, that they would like to relegate the historicity of caste to a colonizer and say British made caste system. And we are not unfamiliar with the debate, and and so is with happening with the people who think on the center and left. There is not much focus. So I think we need a British colonial interface, but also I think one can really look through a theological as well as I was saying, comparative cultural studies. So you can perhaps find more registers in that order.
further.
So we have another question from Professor Bhattacharya. Thank you so much for your presentation. Given that conventional approaches to area studies and historical biases inherent within disciplinary frameworks such as anthropology, sociology, and human rights discourage the kind of global and interdisciplinary work we need to do, how can we within academia create more spaces conducive to addressing these issues? Is laws, inclusion of the human rights framework the most promising space we have now?
Nilanjan, I really thank you for that, and I see that as an invitation to kind of almost a call to action, especially and given that the spaces you talk about, anthropology and human rights and so I am on board with that as well. Critique though, right? I'm not perpendicularly promoting only this focus. What I'm saying is perhaps we can decenter frameworks, right? Now, when we talk about colonization, we end up talking about the globe, right? Because we use the templates and we use the frameworks. So oppression of a certain kind has there are particularisms that we need to pay attention to, and certainly that's what there goes my hesitation to an agreement with you, especially within the conventional disciplines, that we need to really bring the regional or particular or decentered focus, which doesn't need to be local, but needs to be local. I think though, in addition to that, one should not discourage the possibility of something like that could help us, right? So one can really start off with, I think, to do with practically is to test the model, if it at all it is workable. And one of the best ways to do is, I think, is we put to trial some of the concepts and their applicability, if their usefulness or uselessness to our society. Colonialism may be one of that. Oriental thought may be one of that. These are the concepts that the generation before us or two generations dealt with it, wrestled with it, and now also they are coming to terms. But so I think that always a concept that was developed from the viewpoint of the oppressed had a global appeal. When we talk about the Black issue in America, it doesn't really remain American because, of course, the imperial America, but it remains like people draw inspiration. Black Lives Matter becomes, so there is already a location that can help us work with this. So I personally think there should not be a problem for as long as we can contest, compete, and probably complement the theories that can bring from this various societies. So law could be one, human rights could be one, but also I think social sciences also has a responsibility. I don't know how much divinity or religion studies can do, but certainly that remains to be explored.
Thank you. We have another question asking, how does the immigrant fall into the caste system? Is there an intersection between the limitations on the lower caste globally and the limitations on the immigrant communities around?
It's a very interesting parallel, right? The immigrant and the question of caste, because I think, of course, it works also on the question of statelessness, vulnerability, lack of protection, and I welcome that comparison, not least because it's easy to make sense, but also I think that those diversions that exist within certain settled economy of labor, as well as this mobile arbitrary navigating form of labor seen in the immigrant context. I think the lower caste communities that you talk about, they again don't remain part of this conversation, right? Like when we talk about immigration, let's say for Dalits, you don't really have a framework. You can talk about immigration of Indians, South Asians, you can talk about immigration of Bengali, Hindi, Marathi, but there really isn't. Yet these groups, they kind of defy the existing norms of not just being Bengali, but they could be someone who is Bengali, also Hindi or Marathi or Indian or Pakistani, or, and so forth. And I was actually in conversation with a lower caste who is now a priest, Nigerian, Osu, who is in America, who's doing a PhD and all, and how their articulation, they also live under almost similar fears because of the hegemonic appraisal of their identity being subsumed under, oh, I am from Igbo land, or maybe I am from ET state, and so forth. So I think we see that the limitations that you're talking about is I guess there is a parallel, and probably there is an intersection in that context. But again, as I'm saying, immigration itself has a hierarchy, and we need to be considerate to that.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple more questions, but maybe we can pick one for because we have limitation on time. So another question is, thank you so much, Professor Yengde, for this insightful and important talk. How does the framework of global caste relates to the framework of racial capitalism? Is it useful to foreground relations between the two? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm happy. These are excellent questions. These are also encouraging to think in interesting ways. I have a feeling that we can certainly foreground the logic of racial capitalism, and certainly I think they can. I mean, I'm almost thinking it's like a complementary passage from both of it. The kind of the identifiers of racial capitalism, the way it operates, the historical methodology that it employs. Some of the outcomes within that framework might give rise to the question of global caste, and likewise vice versa. If we focus on global caste as a theoretical entree, we might also be able to make sense of capitalism, not necessarily always racial. It can be caste, it can be ethnic. What scholars have talked about it being a particular form of capitalism. So racial capitalism could be one of that, and I'm saying because there is a lot of work that is being done, but it's happening very much right now as we speak, because of course due to the colonial archive that has kept much more intellectual scope for people to develop, think, and reflect. And you see phenomenal scholars from the global South framework or within the racial capitalist framework providing their understanding of the society. We don't have enough registers, I think, in the context of global caste. So we might as well work on a comparative frameworks, and something I'm saying like some of these could be complementary if done in persuasion.
Can I ask a question? Suraj, one question from my side, and that goes into the direction of asking whether you can see, I mean, as much it is convincing to say that caste theory may very well and should very well be used and to analyze and to understand the complexities of social injustice and oppression in many other parts of the world than just India. And while that argument is we can very well see that in particular also with regard to Africa, and we can see that caste works here very much on this original idea of pollution and purity in kind of segregating a whole set of hierarchical social groups and communities and keeping them all separate. While on the other hand, does it perhaps also make sense to keep up a different theory that comes out of race, which probably with all the connectivities that we can see and similarities, but does it perhaps also make sense to keep some of the nuances with regard to racial studies, which was much more on a, and correct me if I'm wrong, on a polarizing scheme, which however then also comes up with a lot of intersectional groups, which are, you talked about these groups that are classified as mestizos, etc., where, as you say, race much more lends to, to combine with biology, with gender, with sexuality, etc. Does it perhaps also make sense to keep the two theories separate, while seeing that, of course, it is important to put them together to enhance the critique of social injustice, but perhaps theoretically, does it perhaps also make sense to keep some aspects apart?
I absolutely agree. In fact, whatever you said, Alexander, I am on board with that. In fact, what I'm saying is, I mean, I'm not even certainly advocating for discounting of the work that has been done, especially when it comes to race or racial sciences, racial social sciences, the studies of colonialism, and so forth. I'm saying is within those frameworks, the limitations that we might come across, we might not, but the limitations we might come across, especially I can talk that through South Asian context, is there is a scope to develop, and there is an understanding. So certainly the studies of race and race-based approach can help in situating the paradox of society, and they can operate independently of each other. They can communicate with each other, but I'm advocating that just solo or mono race-based approach might not necessarily be a helpful one, especially in this society. And that's why, as I said at the beginning, I was giving the kind of almost mini history of how the categorizations, formulate within certain societies and doesn't reflect to certain societies. And I'm also concerned about the vulnerable group within these racialized identities, right? I am racialized in certain context, but in certain context, there's nothing to do with my race, right? Like there is this thing of within, like a friend from Africa, especially critical researchers and journalists were telling me that the question of race, how do you really deal with that in Africa, right? And so in the immigration context in the global north, it becomes important because then the race refines and revolves into different markers. There are incredible studies, and within the caste studies also, people look at, especially in the social movement context, that there are some parallels that can be drawn and inspiration that can be taken. But also, I think it needs to be careful to not totalizing, and the Dalit groups, I know they don't do the totalizing, there is a particularity. So yes, on the three counts, that racializing theory can exist independently. Yes, it can share and act as inspiration or research, and yes, there are moments where this might prevail and that might not, and so I'm very cautious to not present it as a competing or pitting one against another, because then it really creates, you know what I mean? And that's why I was very careful to not even enter the domain of the racial context in the colonial, because that's a rich, that's a vast, and that's a very deep archive that one has to grapple with. But the problem is, an Indian Brahmin comes to the US and becomes a scholar of race. Now that's a paradox right there, because what to do of this Brahmin who is happy to be informed as a racial category, because it in certain way benefits within the what Isabel Wilkerson argues is the caste hierarchy of America. So that's where we have the problem. And I was saying, Brahmin or Brahmin-like characteristics are not unique to India. They do exist in other parts of the world. They need to be foregrounded adequately, or else then what we will do is we will create this meta identity of this extremely complex, diverse, divided group, and then what will happen to what Julian was going to their human rights? What will happen to how can I as a Dalit go to the UN and argue for my rights? because someone like me or someone who belongs to the imposed category or acknowledged category is already representing me. So when I'm saying, they're like, what do you mean by that? And so it's like, don't suffocate us, the bureaucratic regimen is too strong. And so, but history always says that caste was always considered as a primary arbiter. And over the time, and I want to be very clear that the racial register is something that can exist. I only alluded to racial caste that was being framed. So there is an element of racial understanding of this through the fixed identity of caste, which is hierarchy, which is endogamy, which is granting a lower status, and which is structural, institutional, and cultural.
Well, thank you. Shall we conclude here and close? Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, of course, Suraj. It was a great pleasure and inspiration listening to you. Thank you to all the students and colleagues and friends out there of the center, and we hope to see you again in our lecture series next week. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.